Hello, I'm Alec Avdakov, and welcome to the life and times of Frederick the Great. I am extremely grateful to all Patreon members in this amazing community. This is the best way to help the podcast, and for just $5 a month, you will not only receive extra content, but you can listen to the episodes ad-free a day early. The most recent Patreon-only episode is about the 1745 imperial election in the Holy Roman Empire. If you want some extra fun details about an interesting topic, go sign up on Patreon today. Also, remember that the 50th episode is a Q&A episode, so be sure to reach out to me with your best questions. I appreciate any feedback you give me, and also be sure to follow me on social media. But anyway, let's get to the heart of the matter. In the last narrative episode, Frederick started the Second Silesian War and invaded the Austrian province of Bohemia. Unlike the First Silesian War, where he successfully kept the ground he took, Frederick and the Prussian army were forced out of Bohemia without even fighting a battle. The Austrians, it would seem, have learned a thing or two since the first war against Prussia. Today's episode will have 3 key points. Looking at the diplomatic situation after the failure of Frederick's invasion, the build-up to the eventual Battle of Hohenfriedberg, and the battle itself. Honestly, I'm a bit intimidated to be talking about this topic because I consider this one of Frederick's great battles. But we'll cross that river when we get to it. So, if you remember back in the last episode, Saxony had switched sides and joined the war against Prussia. On Prussia's side, there was France, Spain, and Bavaria. But on the Austrian side, there was the economic powerhouse of Britain, which had the largest navy in the world, Sardinia, and now Saxony, who was also the king of Poland. Saxony, ever since the War of Polish Succession, had been closely aligned with Russia. Now that Frederick's invasion of Bohemia had well and truly failed, it was now very possible Russia might join in a war against Frederick. Prussia had signed a defensive alliance with Russia back in 1743, but there was definitely opposition to Frederick in the Russian court. The main Russian minister, Bestuzhev, advised Empress Elizabeth to fight against Prussia now that their war against Sweden was over. The main Russian worry was that Prussia's growing strength would disrupt the balance of power in Europe against Russia. For instance, what if Prussia became allies with Sweden and threatened the Russian position in the Baltic? Or what if Prussia took over parts of Poland and became even stronger without any Russian compensation? Bestuzhev did not want to completely destroy Prussia, just to turn back the clock to where Prussia was a second-class power. Elizabeth at this time did not have a passionate hatred of Prussia and continued to be neutral. For now. We left off in December of 1744, when Frederick had just made it across the border into Silesia with an extremely battered Prussian army. In military terms, not much happened in January beyond skirmishing and soldiers freezing their butts off in winter camps. But, in the diplomatic world, crap hit the fan in January of 1745. To start, we must talk about the Treaty of Warsaw, or, as nobody else calls it, the Warsaw Pact 1.0. This treaty was signed on January 8, 1745, and was known as the Quadruple Alliance. This means that the number of countries in this alliance was, say it with me, 4. The members were Great Britain, Austria, Saxony, and the United Provinces of the Netherlands. The treaty was signed in Warsaw because the ruler of Saxony was also the king of Poland. Frederick believed that this alliance was squarely against Prussia. He even heard rumors that Prussia would be split between Austria, Hanover, Saxony, and Poland. In this case, Prussia would only have a sliver of its newly found power. In fact, Two of the main sources I used, Christopher Duffy and David Fraser's book on Frederick the Great, believe that this war was essentially a war of survival for Prussia in 1745. According to Duffy, quote, Austria and Prussia were not fighting for third parties or for compensations or equivalents, but for the possession of Silesia and the very existence of the Prussian state. In fact, in December of 1744, Maria Theresa made a speech saying that the people of Silesia no longer had to pledge allegiance to Prussia in hopes that Silesia would be conquered by Austria. Things looked awfully bad for Prussia in mid-January of 1745. The army freezing and exhausted, an alliance looking to crush Prussia, and Russia looming in the distance. But you all know this feeling. As soon as you think things can't possibly be any worse, that's when something completely unexpected happens to make the situation even more worse. On January 20th, 1745, Emperor Charles VII, formerly known as Charles Albert of Bavaria, died at the age of just 47. This was a complete shock to Europe. One of the last acts of Charles was to make sure that his son, Maximilian, was of age to rule. After all, Maximilian was just 17 years old. If you want a more detailed account of what happens next in imperial politics, there is a Patreon episode all about it. But crucial to this episode, Maximilian begins to negotiate a peace with Austria in the winter. Peace was signed on April 22, 1745, and Bavaria was no longer in the War of Austrian Succession. Even though Bavaria basically had an army that was of very little importance, the political impact of Bavaria leaving the war was massive. Frederick was hiding behind the justification that Prussia was helping to fight a legitimate emperor, Charles VII, to regain his throne. With Charles dead and Bavaria out of the war, Prussia, besides the power that France could muster, was essentially fighting Austria and Saxony alone. However, as we heard in the last episode with Dr. Abel, there was a potential bright spot for the anti-Habsburg alliance. On May 11, 1745, near the village of Fontenoy, a 2-day battle was fought. The fight was won by the French army, which was commanded by the famous Maurice de Saxe. While not directly affecting the Prussian situation, there were some indirect benefits. The Austrian Netherlands, today Belgium, was under severe threat, thus weakening the overall situation of the Quadruple Alliance, or unofficially, the Warsaw Pact 1.0. Now that the diplomatic situation continues to be as clear as mud, let's move on to look at what Fritz has been up to since the failed invasion of Bohemia in 1744. The condition of Prussia's finances in 1745 was absolutely disastrous. In short, Prussia was almost broke. The huge war chest that was built up during his dad's reign was gone. He couldn't get a loan from any Dutch banks because why would they finance a state in the alliance opposite them? Frederick then reached out to the nobles. But if you go back to one of the earliest episodes, you'll remember that Prussian nobles were quite poor compared to nobles in other European states. Frederick, as king in Prussia, owned a vast amount of Prussia's land directly. This means that Prussia would gain the state's wealth from the land he personally owned. You must also remember that Prussia, as a whole, was a very poor state. Silesia was really the only rich province in the kingdom. Beyond that, the whole region was very swampy and sandy. This sandy soil made it bad for farming in a society that heavily depended on agriculture. In short, Prussia had no money in 1745. Frederick was in Potsdam in March 1745 to try to raise money any way he could. However, this was not a total war where all resources in society were going to the war. Therefore, on March 14th, 1745, Frederick began the construction of the palace that would later be called Sanssouci. After all, the war won't last forever, right? You could call it vanity or call it genius on his part. Either way, there's a beautiful building in Potsdam that you can still visit because of him. Now for the fun part of the episode, the military campaign of the first half of 1745 in Central Europe. Between December 1744, when Frederick crossed the border back into Silesia after his botched invasion attempt, and May 1745, the war was essentially just skirmishes. Frederick left for Silesia the next day after he laid the first stone at Sanssouci on March 15, 1745. On his way back to the new military headquarters, Fritz stopped at the Silesian capital, Breslau. He set up his HQ at the monastery at Kamenz on April 29th. So, beyond the French victory in the Austrian Netherlands at Fontenoy, Frederick had some other good news on the military front. On May 22nd, 6,000 Prussians held off an attack against the outnumbering Austrians. Frederick later used hindsight to place this point as the, quote, revival of the Prussian cavalry. So, on the operational level, Prussia was waiting for an attack from a unified force from Austrian and Saxon forces. Frederick waited nearly all of May without hearing any news of an enemy attack. Imagine the routine Frederick must have been for that month. The suspense must have been intense. But, on May 26th, Frederick received the news that 40,000 Austrians and 19,000 Saxons were on their way to take back Silesia. Ironically, the Saxon section of that army was commanded by the Duke of Weissenfels. If you go to my Patreon, there is a special episode about Frederick's sister, Wilhelmina. But, back in the day, there were negotiations for Wilhelmina to marry the Duke of Weissenfels. Could you imagine if he was Frederick's brother-in-law? Crazy stuff. The Prussian army now numbered a little under 59,000 men at a camp in a town called Frankenstein in southern Silesia. Frederick's force was made up of 42,000 infantry, roughly 14,000 heavy and medium cavalry known as cuirassiers and dragoons, and about 2,300 light cavalry or hussars. Frederick believed that the best way to decide this war in Prussia's favor would be to have a decisive battle. No more of these skirmishes or light cavalry attacks that slowly defeated him. He needed one huge victory in order to create peace with Austria and Saxony. According to Frederick, this battle should take place on the plains of Silesia. While this does risk the richest province in Frederick's kingdom from being overrun by Austrian light forces, it was Frederick's best hope. This would make the strengths of his superior infantry more pronounced. So, Frederick's plan was that he would fake weakness. There were two main ways Frederick would outfox the Austrians. Apparently, Frederick had an Italian spy in the camp of Prince Charles of Lorraine, the Austrian commander. The spy was spreading disinformation that Frederick intended to retreat towards Breslau. This information was confirmed, in air quotes, when the Prussian army retreated from the Austrians towards the fortress of Schweidnitz. The Austrian fish was now hooked. It was time to reel it in. The Austrian army was now a week's march into Silesia. On June 1st, 1745, the Prussian army was in between Schweidnitz and Alt-Jauernich. It was hiding in a low wooded area that could not be seen from the main path Frederick believed the Austrians would take. Fritz personally scouted the area in front of him around the villages of Striegau and Hohenfriedberg. The very next day, the Austro-Saxon army showed its head west of the village of Hohenfriedberg. The Allied army marched without any consideration that they were being watched. Frederick began to calculate his plans when on June 3rd he saw that the Austro-Saxon army would soon be marching again. Here is a passage from what Frederick saw on this decisive day. Quote, "The dust disappeared, and we now had a clear view of the Austrian army, which was debouching from the hills in 8 great columns to the sound of drums, trumpets, and all those military instruments which appeal so much to the Germans. This pleasing harmony, together with the sound of horses, made a concert of sound that was calculated to inspire anyone into combat." This scene describes an Austro-Saxon army that had no idea the danger it was in. They were in a line that was roughly 4 miles long and did not care to occupy any good defensive positions. It was 8 p.m. June 3rd when Frederick told his friend, quote, "Tomorrow will be an important day for me." Frederick devised a very intricate plan to win a battle against the Allied army. To start, he would march the Prussian army at night to surprise the enemy army. They would march on a route that looked like a horseshoe on a map. They would start by marching up north to Striegau, cross the Striegauer Wasser or the nearby river, and march west. They would then march south to roll up the Allied army's left flank like an old carpet, essentially marching a half circle to get to the enemy's flank. The Prussian army began their night march at 9 p.m., and only the cannons were allowed to use the roads. The foot soldiers were up to their knees in water, and they were ordered to march as quietly as possible. They were even told they were forbidden from smoking. You try telling a soldier in war not to smoke. Yet, despite all the extreme difficulties of a night march in the 1700s, the soldiers made it to the edge of the Striegauer Wasser at roughly 1 a.m. So far, this march has been an incredible feat of organization and discipline. It could have easily scattered the men or taken longer than expected. But the day's pay had not been fully earned for the Prussian soldiers. There was still an important battle to be fought. At 2:30 in the morning, Frederick told his generals his plan for the coming fight. The Prussian army would cross the stream at 3 places. Most of the cavalry would cross near Striegau in the north, the main body of the army at Graben, and the cavalry of the left wing, including the Zieten Hussars, would cross the stream in the south near Teichau. The goal of the maneuver was to break the Allied army by having the main attack come from the north and roll up the Austro-Saxon left flank. The army would attack in echelon, meaning that the attack would be a diagonal line from right to left. This puts pressure on the whole enemy line and would cause gaps to form in their lines if the Prussians were to attack with exact timing and discipline. The Battle of Hohenfriedberg was one of the most disjointed and scattered of all the battles of Frederick the Great. In truth, it fits the character of a quote that is often attributed to Frederick about battle. Quote, "Artillery adds dignity to what is otherwise an ugly brawl." Therefore, we will never know the exact events that took place on this battle because of the confusing nature of the battle itself. For instance, there are sickening amounts of smoke that made the whole battlefield impossible to be seen because of the weapons that were used at the time. Battle maps have a way of simplifying a completely chaotic situation. But here's the best I can do to recount what happened with the sources I have available to me. So, there was something that Fritz didn't plan on when he was planning his attack. Saxon troops had already occupied positions east of the Striegauer Wasser. In fact, only the Austrians lit campfires that night, and many Saxon troops had crossed the stream on the Prussian side. Striegau, a village on the west side of the stream, was occupied by roughly 4 companies of Saxon and Austrian grenadiers. The commander of the Prussian force that was attacking Striegau heavily outnumbered the enemy forces and led 6 battalions of grenadiers and 28 squadrons of cavalry. If you remember, the grenadiers were the elite soldiers of Frederick's army. The battle had begun at about 2 a.m. with random and confused fights between Prussian and Allied forces along the stream. There's a story in Duffy's book that you have to take with a few tablespoons of salt that was said to have happened when Prussian light cavalry surprised the Allied companies. Duffy writes, quote, "A Prussian hussar came up to this force and inquired, quote, 'Are you Austrians or Prussians?' On hearing that they were Austrians, he removed his cap and duly noted, quote, 'And I am a Prussian hussar,' and he rode down the hill." More than likely, this exact event didn't happen, but hey, fun story nonetheless. The cavalry commander attacking Striegau asked Frederick for some artillery support to clear the town of the Allied garrison. The report reached Fritz at 4 a.m., and Frederick immediately sent 2 batteries in support. Little did the commander know that only 4 companies occupied Striegau. The capture of Striegau by the Prussians was almost inevitable without artillery. The Prussians, therefore, occupied the village of Striegau after crossing the stream. This was the lighting of the fire underneath the butt moment for the Saxon commander, the Duke of Weissenfels. He organized a line of cavalry to defend southeast of a village named Pilgrimsheim. The fighting that took place here was complete chaos. Christopher Duffy said that it had the same character as a swarm of bees. The Prussian heavy cavalry broke formation on their original charge into the Allied line. While the Prussians did outnumber the Allied cavalry, and there were 2 batteries of artillery in support, the charge did not have enough momentum. Now, there were hussars, dragoons, heavy cavalry, and even mounted infantry all within this bloody mass of chaos. This was the situation in the north, a confusing cavalry fight. The main body of the Prussian army, the infantry, crossed the stream on a bridge further south at a town called Graben. Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau, or the Old Dessauer, formed the first line across the stream. It was around 6 a.m. when the Prussian line of 21 battalions advanced against the Saxon troops with their muskets on their shoulder. They continued to march despite the loud volleys and canister shots ripping huge gaps in their lines. One moment, you could be marching with your best friend you grew up with your whole life. The next, your Fred's head could have exploded with the shot that was fired from the cannons. Despite this horrible proposition, the Prussian line kept moving forward. They fired their first volley at about 400 yards away. This firefight between the 2 sides was a blood-filled killing ground. But at 7 a.m., the fight against the Saxon army that had opposed them had been won. The Saxons all ran for their lives. Frederick believed, quote, "The battle is won." However, the Austrian army could still turn the tide of the day's fight. As all of this was taking place on the front lines against the Saxon army, the Prussian infantry continued to cross the Striegauer Wasser. It was now up to the Prussian army to build up enough strength to crush the Austrian army left on the field. The Austrian army had its defense set up with positions in the village of Güntersdorf in the north, the area between Güntersdorf and Thomaswaldau in the center, and Halbendorf in the south. This line was diagonal from northwest to southeast. The Prussians were still building up strength when a 24-year-old Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick advanced alone on Güntersdorf with 5 regiments. If Prince Charles of Lorraine had the sense to, that isolated brigade should have been dog meat. Instead, there was no attack from the Austrians. The Prussians then advanced with a battle line that was made up of a little over 10,000 infantry. If you remember the situation up north near Pilgrimsheim, the Prussian cavalry outnumbered the Saxon and Austrian cavalry. But in the south, the Prussian cavalry was outnumbered by roughly 1,000 men, the Prussians with about 6,000 and the Austrians with about 7,000 cavalry. What made it worse is that the men were having a tough time crossing the stream. The heavy cavalry crossed first with about 10 squadrons and advanced near Thomaswaldau. Little did the Prussian cavalry commander know that the brigade Little did the Prussian cavalry commander know that the bridge had freaking collapsed as they advanced. These 10 squadrons were all alone. The situation looked completely desperate when a loudmouth short man from Fehrbellin charged with his hussars. That's right, Zieten managed to find a ford in the stream and crossed over the water as quickly as possible to save the situation. More cavalry crossed the stream through Zieten's ford until the Austrian right wing broke under Prussian pressure. The commander of the Austro-Saxon army, Prince Charles, was nearly captured during this part of the fight. In the north and the south, the Prussian cavalry had broke the Allied cavalry. These are no longer the men of Mollwitz who stood against a charge in the snow. By 8 a.m., the fighting was now concentrated in the center, with infantry taking the center stage. There were over 19,000 men left in the remaining Austrian line that consisted of infantry. The battle was extremely loud and full of blinding smoke. The Prussians shot quicker and were more disciplined than the Austrians. However, the Austrian artillery continued to pound away against the Prussians. Now, for the iconic moment of the battle, the Bayreuth Dragoons. So far, this elite cavalry regiment had been placed behind the infantry lines right across from the center of the fight. They had crossed the Striegauer Wasser, but that was about it. There was, however, a gap forming between the regiment of the Duke of Bevern and Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick's brigade on the Prussian side. It is unknown to history who ordered the Bayreuth Dragoons to advance against the enemy infantry. All we know is that suddenly, at 8:15 a.m., the Bayreuth Dragoons began their attack. Remember that this is only one regiment of cavalry who attacked an Austrian line that outnumbered them. But the Bayreuth Dragoons galloped their horses and smashed right into the very center of the Austrian line. The sabers were bloody as they cut down anyone in front of them. The Bayreuth Dragoons in 20 minutes captured, quote, 5 cannons, 67 colors, and 2,500 prisoners, losing just 94 men in the process. If all of this sounds hard to believe, that's because it is. The dragoons were outnumbered, yet completely destroyed the Austrian center with boldness and tenacity. Frederick wrote to the old Dessauer, quote, "This is the best thing I have ever seen. The army has surpassed itself." The battle ended at 9 a.m. Everything from the deception Frederick used to lure the Austro-Saxon army into Silesia to the use of combined arms of cavalry, infantry, and artillery to win the fight had nearly perfectly pulled off. However, there was no pursuit. If you consider that the Prussians began their march at 9 p.m. the previous day and fought a large-scale battle, it makes sense that the army would be completely exhausted. But still, the battle had been won, and it was now time to rest after a long 12 hours. The overall losses were extremely lopsided. The Allied army had lost roughly 13,800 men, including 3,120 men killed, whereas the Prussians had only lost about 4,700 casualties, including 900 men killed. We will deal with the aftermath of this battle in the next episode, however. I believe we must marinate on this confusing series of events. The first half of 1745 looked disastrous for Frederick's Prussia with the signing of the Quadruple Alliance in Warsaw. However, the situation began to brighten after the news of Fontenoy and a successful cavalry skirmish against the Austrians. However, the month of June began with an exclamation point for the Prussian army at the Battle of Hohenfriedberg. This battle on June 4th, 1745, was a major tactical success for the Prussian army. We will see what Frederick will do with this hard-fought victory. To conclude today's episode, we will listen to the Hohenfriedberger March that was written in honor of this victory. And so I shall say to you all, auf Ansbach Dragoner, auf Ansbach Bayreuth.